President Stephanie voluntold me that I'd be the program chair for her term. We bounced a million ideas back and forth, along with hearing from CEOs and the usual programming we always do. We wanted to explore certain themes. I wanted membership to learn about disinformation, and the threat it poses to our whole society and our city. Stephanie wanted to focus on the common ground we all share in this room to push for common good. So we threw out a bunch of ideas. Some seemed easy to pull off, some seemed ludicrous. At the time, in the wake of the George Floyd and the Ahmaud Arbery and similar cases, questions about equity and race were very much in the air. Atlanta was frequently described as a city that led the nation in income inequality and had done so for more than a decade, driven by our city's history of racial disparities. With many looking into this issue, it seemed like a no-brainer of a program. If your city has a huge problem the rest of the country is pointing a finger at, well, look into it, especially since it will impact the city's future, neighborhoods, law enforcement, governance, future workforce, and so on. And after all, since this is the room where the Atlanta Friendship Initiative truly began, and we had shown our willingness to ask and have tough conversations about race, the program seemed like an easy layup. Meanwhile, other ideas seemed impossible. Roger Goodell? Ridiculous. Well, Roger Goodell turned out to be a whole lot easier than putting together a meaningful program on equity. But why? Because equity, that word, it's a buzzword that means different things to different people. It's a word that's bandied about as part of the grudge match that characterizes so much of our national dialogue. For some folks, it's a goal society must strive for. For others, mandating equity is a sign of everything that's wrong. So what to do? Well, listen to all sides is what we decided. 2 civic leaders who run philanthropies that are deeply engaged in the city, 2 business people, 2 people of color, 2 white folks, use common ground to help us understand an issue that gets polluted by the usual conversations that are out there. Our former president, Clark Dean, will moderate. Gentlemen, please come on stage. The microphones are on. You don't have to fiddle with them. And I do want to thank these speakers for being willing to step into this difficult arena to put themselves on the line to have a conversation about a tough subject. Frank Fernandez, Milton Little, David Allman, and Clark Dean. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, and thank all of you for actually coming to a program on equity. So, we were a little concerned when they announced this. Were there going to be 12 people in the room, or were people going to turn out? And I voted for the people who are going to turn out to hear this, and so I thank you for being here to do it. And well said. Equity tends to be a bit of a third-rail topic, but I think a lot of that has to do with how people are defining equity and how people are sometimes manipulating people with issues. And so one of the things that we're going to do today is really get into what does this issue mean, why is it important, what can we as Atlantans do, and what is that business case and the civic case for equity. And so we're excited to do that. It's going to be super conversational, and we're going to jump right in with the first question. And I'm going to pose this first question. I'm going to jump over to David Allman so if those of you who don't know David's a very successful businessman, real estate developer. Also has an unbelievable mission in Nicaragua, which is tremendous. I think a lot of folks in this room have been down there. But David, when you hear the word equity or you think of equity, how do you define equity?
The first thing that comes to mind with the word is just fairness, or some sense of justice, impartiality, kind of in a neutral sense. I once had somebody explain the concept to me, saying, if you flipped a coin and you were wanted to know, you wanted to set the rules before the coin came down, and you didn't know where you were on the head side or the tail side. You didn't know where you were born. You didn't know, who your parents were. You didn't know what kind of giftedness or lack thereof you had. What would you want the rules to be like? What would you want the system to be like? So even like in real estate, we talk about the buy-sell and some contracts. It's where if you've got a partner and you have a provision there, if you need to split up, and there's a provision that says you can trigger the buy-sell, which means the person that triggers it initially or initiates it has to decide the fair price. And so if you go too high, you're going to overpay. If you go too low, he's going to buy you out cheaply. So it forces you to think of that middle ground that is ultimately fair. And so to me, it's a neutral term that just says we want a fair, impartial playing field.
Outstanding. Frank, what do you think about equity? I know it's something that you deal with every day in your job. I mean, how do you define equity?
I think a big part of the challenge is that there really isn't necessarily one definition of equity. To me, the best comparison I've heard is that the Inuit have like a couple dozen different definitions of snow. I think equity is kind of like that. It has all these different layers to it that are all valid and kind of get at different aspects of it, but it is something that is pervasive and ubiquitous in a lot of ways in terms of our lives, in terms of its implications. And so that's, I think, part of the challenge. I think for me, I would define it probably very similar to how David defined it at a high level. And then I think in terms of, it's this idea of fair equality of opportunity, right? In that those who are similarly situated and who have similar talents should have similar chances for success, right? If you really try to define it. It then is just then getting into the nitty-gritty. Well, then, as you break that down, how? Right? And I think that's where some of the challenges go. But at a very, very high level, that's one of the definitions that I kind of latch on to.
Absolutely. So Milton, I mean, again, in this building, you guys think about this stuff all the time. You see it across so many nonprofits across our city. How do you define it? When you think of equity, what does it mean to you?
Well, there's not much left after Frank and David. Equity is about fairness. It's about justice. It's about the notion that people ought to receive unfettered access to the opportunities for which their talents will enable them to both obtain and have the kind of life, a full participation in all elements of society. Equity is not equality. Equality means you treat everybody the same, regardless of where they start, regardless of what they need. But equity is really about the notion that people will get the resources and supports they need given wherever they start, because not everybody starts off at the same place on the starting line. And not everybody outside of this community is born, like many of us, on third base, thinking that we got there on our own. So we've got to be sure we pay attention to the fact that people start off in different places for a variety of reasons and not conflate equity and equality. That's where a lot of the conversation then begins to disappear and falter, really.
No, absolutely. And I think that one of the things in our conversations leading up to this one that really resonated with me was this idea of equity being this idea that everyone deserves to have the ability to live up to their fullest potential. Like, what is their full potential? And what can we do? And I look around the room, and I mean across this stage, you guys are helping people try to achieve their full potential every day in the things that we're doing. And I think that a lot of times that piece of it gets left out. It's like, well, gee, I mean, if we can invest in people, and yeah, you invest differently in people because somebody might need something different to achieve their full potential. But boy, if they could achieve their full potential, what kind of value would that have, not only to them and their families, but to our city, our community, our businesses? That there's a business case associated with this idea of equity and what it means. So as we kind of think through that, sort of this business case for equity, and David, you might want to share a little bit more about your Nicaraguan thing, because I think there's a lot of themes with that where, this is a blighted part of the world that is really tough, has some difficult governmental structures and people living in abject poverty. But through your adoption of some really great ideas from Bob Lupton and others, and this idea of toxic charity, trying to really empower people to reach their full potential and the impact they've had there. I mean, there's things like that can be done here as well. So maybe you could share with that as part of that business case for equity.
Yeah, people are low income. Often their greatest felt need is economic mobility. And there are a lot of impediments that people face in terms of addressing upward mobility. And the legitimate role of an outsider in this case is, how do you facilitate bridging that gap with addressing things. So we deal with a lot of smallholder subsistence farmers. So how do we give them access to credit? How do we give them access to good technical practices? How do we process their crops into a value-added product? And then ultimately, how do we connect them to the global supply chain? So some of that is empowering the people on the ground. Some of it's using market skills to create a business solution that allows these smallholder farmers to kind of aspire to kind of middle-class status. But it's important to understand the role that you can play. It's important for the individuals to want to aspire for better, and most people do if they're given legitimate hope and legitimate chances of realizing that. So, we spent 18 years down in Nicaragua now, but, we didn't make money for 15 years. But we knew, our board, our director, we knew that the economic driver was going to be critical. So now that we have reached profitability about 2 or 3 years ago, we're able to hire more people, we're able to pay them better. These are plant workers. We probably have a payroll of about 175 in country now. We really do. We can pay our farmers better. Private insurance. We can do more work in the communities. The school we started, we can hire better, train better, teach better. So when you think about the business case, to me, it's ultimately the driver that allows so many of these other things to take place. It creates sustainability, and you're helping people help themselves in a sense. So I think it's just really important to understand how important the business model is in terms of if you can make the business case or the business platform, then that allows so many other things to occur. I think you can go further, you can go faster, you can sustain it, that if you don't have that business component. And I studied economics and capitalism in college, and capitalism is basically about voluntary exchange, where people come together to transact goods or services in their own self-interest. It's an agreed-upon transaction where both parties perceive that they're better off because they're entering into it. And I think whenever you can do voluntary versus, say, coercive, which to me has always had, not always, but often has unintended consequences and can create resentment or backlash. I just think that if you can get there with voluntary cooperation, people that may be mission-minded to be sure, but if you can do it with voluntary cooperation, I think you can just go further and faster.
I'm just going to piggyback on that and kind of contextualize it here in Atlanta. So for our organization, we have a focus on equity. It's the idea of how can we help every resident in this region and do what we can to have a fair shot at a decent and good life, right? And to David's point, economic mobility is a foundational element of that. So one of the things is looking at data, right? Atlanta while it has a lot of income inequality, it also has one of the greatest job growth over the last 10 to 20 years of any major metro area in Atlanta. It's an outlier in a positive way with Austin, Seattle, and a few other cities like that in terms of having that asset. A lot of other metros don't have that. We do. But what we're a negative outlier is in connecting lower income folks to those job opportunities. And I think that to me is part of the business case, because one of the things that we hear a lot, and I know I'm experiencing, and I bet you a lot of the folks here are, is trouble hiring folks. And then depending on your sector, you end up having to go to other parts of the country to bring folks in here because we don't have that pipeline. And so how do we then do a better job collectively of building that pipeline of folks who we know are here, who aren't in the job market, who need to be part of the job market? To me, that is part of the case for equity.
Let me add one more thing to that. So in 2017, United Way launched the Child Wellbeing Initiative that was focused on dealing with the inequities, the health, education, economic mobility, and other kinds of disparities that children primarily living in poor communities were facing. And perhaps the most compelling data point that I ever saw that all of us should pay attention to came in the book Our Kids by Robert Putnam, who said that if Atlanta's social mobility rate for poor children equaled San Francisco's rate, the GDP in Atlanta would grow by 11 percentage points. Not 11%, 11 percentage points. And when you've got GDP growth like that, then all of us benefit. So yes, there is a moral imperative, but if we can sort of sit back and be comfortable with having 11 percentage points less GDP because we have consigned groups of people and groups of neighborhoods to being on the sidelines with respect to the kind of job growth that Frank just talked about, then what's that say about us? And what's that say about our willingness to really do everything we can to truly make this the best state for business? I mean, it could even be better if we decided intentionally that we were going to help poor and low income and kids of color living in a variety of neighborhoods across greater Atlanta have a better shot at getting the kind of jobs that in 2030 are going to be screaming for talent. I mean, the data is real clear. By 2030, we're going to have a significant talent shortfall. And the simplest solution is no longer waiting for somebody to drive east or west from 20 or north or south from 75 or 85. We're going to have to grow talent here. And the best thing that we can do is start now, because the dollars and cents value of that investment is without question.
And the people said, amen. I mean, wow. So I think that was, when we start thinking about equity in our city, what it screams out to us is the unmet potential of our city, of our communities, unmet potential. That if we can invest in folks to give that promise and that opportunity, for those of you who cover these statistics, about 3% unemployment rate right now in Atlanta, which is very low. That's extremely low. We work with a lot of companies. They're looking to come to Atlanta, and they're excited about Atlanta. They love the diverse workforce. They love the great talent coming out of our institutions of higher education. They love all this stuff. What they don't love is 3% seems like really tight. Like, well, I mean, if I need to hire like 1,000 people, am I going to be able to do that? And so I think it's one of these great blessings that Atlanta has, but also the great opportunity that Atlanta has is how can we prepare people to do that? And it's not just the people that we talk about geography, and I want to get into that a little bit. Like, why should it matter where you were born? Should where you were born affect like how far you can go for the rest of your life? I mean, should that matter? And yet so often it does. Then there's like grace and second chances. I mean, how many of you have ever made a mistake, and you're especially young in life? It never happens, of course. I know, it's great. This is the Rotary Club of Atlanta, but if you can imagine other mere mortals in other places, I mean, people make mistakes. And we have this group here from Cafe Momentum that deals with kids that have been through the justice system, kids that made a mistake, have gotten penalized for it, but now find themselves, in many cases, thrown out of schools. They really can't reintegrate. They're not good on any job applications. So equity in that case is providing an opportunity, in this case, a restaurant that trains those kids how to have hospitality jobs, how to learn in that business, to get school finished. This equity. Is it something equal? We give that to everybody? No, it's just these kids that need that. And so I think this business case around equity and really improving the capacity of our economy is a real opportunity for us across the board. I wanted to I know our club has gotten really into the early childhood education bit of it as really an opportunity to lift up young kids who They say that brain development and brain plasticity from 0 to 4 is at all-time high, and then it kind of drops down. Don't worry, we still have a little brain plasticity for the rest of our lives, but 0 to 4, it's like really strong. And the problem is public investment in education is like pretty much zero from 0 to 4, and then it kind of goes up. So what do we do with this? And I know this club has taken some bold steps to try to correct that. But what other things do you think that we can do as people of goodwill who want to help expand these opportunities for people in our city and to improve that equity in order to improve all of our lives?
Well, and hearing Milton talk about health outcomes, education, you think of housing. Of course, Frank and I have been collaborating on that with Sarah and Natalie back there, affordable housing affordability, but you can even think transportation to that. There are certain anchors that they're kind of pillars of having a realistic opportunity to take advantage of the American dream. So I think from a practical point of view, if we start breaking those down one by one, we say, okay, how do we address that one? And I think all of us can do something. I mean, my pastor says, do for the one what you'd like to do for the many. But I think particularly business people from we're typically problem solvers. We understand capital and risk and things like that. We bring certain skill sets to the table, but we've got a lot of nonprofits and government officials that kind of work from the bottom up, that identify the priorities and the needs that, are kind of very missionally from the start. And so, but I think when we do come together and collaborate and bring kind of creativity and, get outside the box, that, we can talk a lot about housing and what we're trying to do in Atlanta to address housing. But there, there's a, it takes all the tools in the toolbox. It takes philanthropy. It takes low-cost debt. It takes building, capacity building, having more for-profit and non-profit builders in there. It takes regulatory reform. You've got to be able to use tax incentives the right way. So, but I think any of these issues that are keeping people back from making that leap, the ones that are ready to say, I'm stuck in a low-wage job, but I aspire to be up here, they know what the impediments are. They can't leave their second job to take the 6 weeks or 6-month training course that would double or triple their income, because they need that second job to pay the bills. So I think if we just get creative, there are incremental things we can do to help the one by one, fill the gap, be the bridge builder where that one person, and then over time more and more, can you give them that opportunity to kind of realize that upward mobility.
So I would go back to something that David said in his opening remarks about the Atlanta Friends Initiative. So it was built around this idea that sameness brings comfort and security. That, we hang out with people who look like us, think like us. We feel pretty comfortable and safe in that. Where growth comes is by engaging in conversations with folks from different places, from different perspectives. You develop a sense of compassion. You develop a sense of willingness to engage in a debate on an issue that is worthy of a conversation. And we try to have those rational conversations on topics like this. Why do I bring that up? I bring that up because the equity conversation isn't simply about race. It's about, me at United Way making sure that I've got a variety of people who serve on the board of United Way, because the only way we're going to grow and be able to relate to various communities is making sure that perspective is there. There's still a significant challenge in corporate America with respect to women and minorities on corporate boards. You ask the question of what can we do? We can be thoughtful about that. We can be thoughtful about where are my perspectives coming from. I heard this phrase the other day, am I a friends and family kind of manager that I only pick from my friends and my family? Or am I going to go outside of that to get folks who can bring a different perspective on how we need to serve our customers, a different perspective on business process, that they've learned through a variety of other ways. And so it's how do we as leaders of our organizations, nonprofit or otherwise, really bring a keen curiosity about what am I missing because everybody who's sitting around this table looks like me? What am I missing because I don't have the recognition that I've got 5 generations of people in my workplace, but I only got 2 generations of people making decisions and creating climate and all of those things. So it's really about us being introspective and thinking about what's in the best interest of the people that we're serving, the customers that we're serving, the community in which we're engaged, and how can I make my enterprise better by bringing in a variety of perspectives that help enrich our approach to business and our place in the business community.
Absolutely. It's funny as you were saying that. Knowledge work is best when you get this tension from different perspectives. And again, it's diversity. I mean, certainly it's racial and gender diversity, but it's also just people from different backgrounds academically, different work backgrounds, people that can attack problems in different ways. And that often allows problems to actually get solved faster. Where oftentimes I might look at a problem and just be like, well, gee, I can't figure it out. Marcus on my team might look at it and have a very different idea. Sagar might have a different idea. And I think that idea of different perspectives based on the time in business, where you're from, the different experiences you had is real value that often gets lost, just in the grand scheme of the conversation. So Frank, what do you think? I mean, you're obviously investing in the city with these programs all the time. And what do you feel like we can really lean into?
I would also go back to something David touched on, which was trying to find common ground and common solutions, right? Because I think what ends up happening, so I would +1 everything David and Milt said, but as we know, is when this gets sticky is when we start talking about disparities, right? Because we know in our community, there's disparities that go along race or class or geography or gender, all these things. The data is very clear. But what do we do with that? And are we willing to engage in a conversation where you may not agree with the other person or another group or perspective 100%, and you focus on the 20, 30% you don't agree with and not on that 70, 80%, which has been my experience, that you do agree, and try to move that forward? Because I think that is part of the challenge that we, I think, are collectively grappling with right now, is that we are separating more. So how do we bring that back to just really being willing to engage in these conversations that sometimes can make us a little uncomfortable, but I would say the alternative is to not do that and to really further separate. Some of the folks here I've had a conversation with. I was in Israel and Palestine earlier this year, and it just really struck me what happens when you're in a place where you take that to the nth degree. And you have a very, very segregated society in a lot of ways, and a lot of folks who just talk past one another. And that is not fruitful, it's not productive, it's not helpful. So so that's the thing I would add. I think all of us have to challenge ourselves. And it's the other one that Milton brought up that I think is really resonated for me is generationally. Because in this post-pandemic world, a lot of our younger staff just think about what work is and what it isn't, and what our requirements are to them and vice versa, very differently than, say, I did in my generation or older. But that is part of equity. That is this conversation that we're having collectively, and it's not easy, in all honesty.
I totally agree. And it's funny. We often talk about high-performing organizations. They can't just be smart. They also have to be healthy. And what is it to have a healthy organization or a healthy city? Health of an organization ultimately gets down to the health of the relationships among us. And health of relationships and trust is really built on the currency of vulnerability. And vulnerability is a currency that has to be given before it can be received. And I think that's what's so important, and I loved, again, our conversations leading up to this one. I feel like so oftentimes words like equity are used as political footballs, by both sides of the spectrum, instead of saying, how do we bring people together and first form healthy relationships and friendships? Because if you have healthy relationships and friendships, then you can duke it out on the issues, because you don't have to worry about the relationship. The relationship's good. Now let's fight over these issues. And you can do that in a healthy way. But if we live in a society where it's not cool to be in a picture with you or to be in a ooh, I don't want to have these kind of conversations. He's my friend. How could you be friends with that person? That's a huge problem. And I think it's a problem that John Grant and Bill Normark saw in the formation of the Atlanta Friendship Initiative, which, for those of you who don't know, the idea was to get people who don't look alike, whether they don't look alike because of the color of their skin or because of their political beliefs or their background or religion or whatever, and get them just to commit to being friends. Like, build those friendships. And on the basis of those friendships, now we can wrestle it out with some of these tough issues and actually make progress and get things done. So I think that there's something to that. Well, one of the questions that equity could go on in so many different ways, but one of the big ones that came down during COVID, obviously, was health equity. And I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on health equity. People say that health problems and end of life are some of the greatest wealth destroyers for the Black and brown communities in particular. What do you think about health equity as an issue? We talked about housing and certainly income, but what about health? How do we need to be addressing that?
Well, it goes back to, something I think all of us referenced earlier. One is this notion of place. There are just a number of communities around the country, around the state, that don't have access to affordable medical care. There are counties in Georgia that don't have one OBGYN, whole counties that don't have them. A pregnant woman, a woman in distress is going to have to get in her car and drive counties away to be able to afford to get care that any of us sitting up here, I'm one phone call away from my concierge doctor. One phone call away. I don't even need an appointment. You just show up. But there are lots of folks that don't have that opportunity at all. We've seen hospitals closing. We've got rural counties that are struggling, seeing rural hospitals closing. This is a fundamental issue, because any of us who've ever been sick, if your teeth hurt, it doesn't matter how much you're making on the job. You want to get those teeth fixed. If you're in pain, the only thing that matters is getting well. All of us know how important basic health is, and to be able to count on a doctor who knows your name and be able to address that. And we're just a state that struggles in that area, and that's one of those issues that, from a public policy perspective, we ought to just decide to do something intentionally because our friends and neighbors are in distress, and that has direct implications for one's ability to educate, one's ability to get a job, one's ability to engage in work on a consistent basis, and a host of other things.
The other thing I'll just add is just a couple of stats that some of you know in terms of just health access and health equity. So there's about a 20-year life expectancy difference between residents of Buckhead and Bankhead. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that, which is very stark. Another one that Anna Roach keeps beating the drum on for the last, 9 months or so, is the difference in ER response times within Fulton County. In North Fulton, it's about 5 minutes to get an ER to come to your home, or EMS to come to your home if you have some sort of medical crisis. It's over 35 minutes in South Fulton. And if you have a stroke, if you have a heart attack, if any basic life health event, that 30-plus minute life difference, it is literally life and death. And so from a health access perspective and thinking about health access as basic infrastructure, to me is what can we do as a community to make sure that folks have access to basic health infrastructure in terms of whether it's comparable ER time or EMS response time, access to hospitals within a reasonable driving period, distance, things like that.
Absolutely, and as you were saying that too, I remember one of the big things that came up certainly during the pandemic was certainly there was a horrific lack of access, certainly in a lot of parts of our country. But the really sad thing, that's sad, but the terrifying thing was that even when those resources existed, they weren't taken because of the lack of trust. And I think that's one of the things, too, that we need to think about in this things of equity. It's building trust. And a lot of it is because communities don't like to be done to. they need to be a part of the conversation. Understand what with the Center for Global Health Innovation, we got involved in a lot of this work, around the city of Atlanta, talking to community. What does community need? And realizing what those needs are and then connecting the dots. What we found is a lot of times there is access, but they either don't know about it or they don't trust it. And so how do we bridge that trust to actually help make a difference? Because it's sort of like that very bottom of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, if you're not healthy, it doesn't matter the education. It doesn't matter you forget everything else if you're in pain. David?
Yeah, and just thinking too, you talk about the physical health, you think about the mental health, and the statistics are beginning to come out, just how much damage was done through the pandemic and the like. And I think of two things there, different type things. You think of a lot of us in this room, when the pandemic hit, we had either a big house or a second home or something where we could retreat to, and we could have the outdoors, and we could have optionality. You think of the people at the lower end of the spectrum that they were basically trapped in a small apartment, and not to mention the lack of access to education and the fallout there. But you also think from kind of my free market side, going back to the control, the mandates, whatever, mandating people to stay indoors as opposed to, say, targeting the people that were highest at risk has unintended consequences, or in this case did have unintended consequences. So I even think from a policy point of view, we really need to think of what are the potential ramifications of these policies as it relates to health outcomes.
Well, and the other thing that you just brought up, and that I do want to open it up for any questions that we might have the floor. I can imagine there are probably a few, but is this idea of what is the role of more flexible workplaces and equity? Not everybody has a home office they can work from. And historically, the office building, the office places, those were the great equalizers. It didn't matter where you came from, what kind of house you drove out of that morning, or what kind of dwelling you walked from that morning. When you got to the office, you had a place that was yours, that based on what you did for that business, or what you did for that nonprofit, or what you did for that's your place. And I think that we risk, a lot of that stuff is put at risk in a way that has not really been discussed a lot. I hear it a lot because of the business I'm in, but there are a lot of folks that don't really think about the equity impacts of this work for home, that it's not always to the best interest of the workers, because not everybody has those resources.
Well, we have to remind ourselves that the Americans with Disabilities Act was perhaps the most significant effort within the workplace to address equity. It was about flexible workplaces. It was about letting folks in that you had historically not let into the workplace, who were perfectly capable of doing the job, even if it had to be organized differently based on their skills. And so we're okay with that, but we ought to be okay with other issues related to opportunity, access, aligning people's skills and ability with the job, and giving them the key to the door and say, come on in, this is a welcoming place.
Well, and when you say that, I reminded of the great work that we do at Shepherd Center. Just a couple of board meetings ago, we had two guys that came. They were both been patients at Shepherd Center, quadriplegics, who graduated from Georgia Tech and now run our technology programs for enhancements for people with disabilities. It's extraordinary. And you look at what potential can be, an unmet potential. There's so much that we can do, and real innovative leaders here in this room that are helping make it happen. I'm just so grateful for you guys. And now I want to open up to some questions.
Let's do it. Y'all are on a roll, by the way. But let's open up to questions from the audience.
They're going
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll jump in. First of all, yes, great idea. And in fact, the state of Georgia, as you know, has some programs that are similar to that through Quick Start and through TCSG. You know, a number of you guys in the TCSG is the Technology College System of Georgia. Lesser known maybe than the university system of Georgia, but has a unique credential of being the largest technology college system in the country. It's extraordinary. And what the state does do is provide training for workforce. When we were working with a big life sciences company from Boston, Baxter Scientific, when they came here, they actually created these very special programs to provide job opportunities for these folks. Not everybody needs a PhD to work in life sciences, by the way. I mean, there's a lot of good paying blue collar life sciences jobs that are really clean and nice and great jobs, but you have to have the right training. And the city and the state does do programs like that, but yes, should they do more? Absolutely. And I think there's some great organizations that are really trying to get creative at how we do that to try to bridge that gap. Any other comments on the economic development?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of free programs to provide the certificates or the education, but there's still, from a lot of these people, a gap coming from somewhere. So I really think it's fertile for some public-private. You get employers like take Kia or whatever that's got all these job openings. They need to put skin in the game toward this. If you get some public assistance, I think those things are very solvable with a little creativity. The state's sitting on big surpluses. The governor, for the first time, started talking about affordable housing on a statewide level. Why? Because he's got manufacturers that want to come to Georgia that can't find housing in the communities where they want to locate. So you still have that business case for it, and if that's what it takes, so be it. But I think it's going to have to be that public-private coming in to stand in the gap, solve the gaps.
This is great. Go ahead, Zach.
Could you talk about the confusion between quality of opportunity and quality of outcomes?
Sure. The idea that everybody needs to have sort of an open door to education, to jobs, to housing, to affordable health care. I mean, most folks don't argue with that. We all believe that hard work ought to be rewarded. We believe that people ought to have a chance to succeed. Those are basic values that I think if we organize around them and stop debating, the nuanced definitions of equity, we'd be in better shape. I think the notion of equality of outcomes is in the same sort of bucket with issues related to the how we achieve equity. We end up debating the process, and the process is where things end up boiling over. But I think this notion of equality of outcomes, I don't know that that is realistic to pursue as a goal. There's no equal outcomes for any of us, What we want is everybody to be able to get to the starting line, not burdened by race, by gender, by their physical ability, by a host of other things, and being able to run and get the jobs and achieve at the outcomes their talents and the opportunities have afforded them. But the idea that we're going to line up together on the start line and we're going to end at the finish line in the same place is a canard that we allow to dominate a conversation when in fact that's not even the issue. The issue is where you start and how unburdened your start is, not where you end up and how lucky you are that regardless of where you started, I'm going to end up the same place that David did, that Frank did, that Helen did, anybody else. That's just not possible. That's not how the world works. But that's not where we ought to be arguing the wisdom, utility, and appropriateness of a commitment to equity.
Well, I was going to say we are running over, but just really well done topic, question. I was just going to ask panelists, did y'all hit everything you wanted to because it's so deep? Is there one question left on your minds that we should have asked?
Not so much a question, is just to pick up a little bit on what Milton was talking about. The other thing I would encourage you all, like to me, when you think about these issues, is like embrace the complexity. This stuff is not black, white. It's not straightforward. It really is multi-layered, right? Because like where my mind immediately went in that question is like equality of, if you believe, and this is going to sound controversial, but I don't think it is, equality of outcome means you don't believe in free will. Think about it. You don't believe in free will. Because if you believe in free will, then people have choice, people have agency, and there's a whole question of desert, moral desert. So equality of outcome actually, for me, doesn't make sense. Where we get stuck is debating in, okay, equality of opportunity, but what is real opportunity? Formal opportunity or fair access to opportunity? That's where the question is. That's where it gets complicated and how we engage with each other on that.
And it reminds me,
Go ahead.
just one last little point, as that question was being asked, I thought about this. How many people have ever been to, not gotten on the train at Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport and walked on the moving sidewalk? Anybody done that, right? Have you ever thought, man, I'm so much faster than these people. Look how, man, I'm good. You know, you walk down this thing and you're going so fast, you're like, well, oh, it's a moving sidewalk, right? So bear with me here. All right, so you're on a moving sidewalk. So you can have a choice. You can like kind of run on the speeding flag. We were a lot faster than these folks. But you go, man, all these poor folks, they don't know this is moving sidewalk over here. So the question, I think we as people of goodwill, as Rotarians, as business leaders, you know, if you could pause for a moment and like, you know, kind of pull somebody on that moving sidewalk and be like, hey, dude, there's like a moving sidewalk here. You like pull on it. Now you're good, better, right? Now it makes like some effort to pull them on a little bit, but that effort is worth pausing to reach down, to reach out to somebody that just is experiencing a different reality, that doesn't understand what's possible. And I think that's the thing. If we can realize what's possible and enable people to reach their full potential, then we're better as civilization. And we have the opportunity to do that if we'll just open our eyes and kind of reduce the clutter of the politics sometimes and just listen to our hearts and what it means to take care of people around us.
As you said, amen to that. So, well, thank you all. Great. Just one of the topics of our times. We're going to have a round of applause one more time. Just let me just say, well, before we do that, just thank you, the four of you, for engaging in this topic. It's complex, it's not easy, and very well done. So thank you all again.